again, cycling and nutrition enthusiasts, and welcome back to another episode of Feel the Pedal podcast with me, your host, Gabriel Martins, that Portuguese guy again, broadcasting from Madrid, a city with great food, culture, and also one of the many places in Spain where cyclists from the pro peloton come for their altitude training, which is the topic that brings us here today. I'm excited about this. Can you tell that I'm excited? I think you can. It's been a while since I wanted to bring this topic to the show, and the day has finally come to tackle this emerging topic with one of the greatest experts in this matter, and some of you might be familiar with. I'm talking about Dr. Trent Stellingwerf. Trent is an applied sports physiologist with a specialization in the area of performance nutrition, and he currently leads the Canadian Sports Institute's Innovation and Research Division. As an experienced researcher, Trent has more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications and is currently on the editorial board for the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance and International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism. Trent has attended many World Championships and Olympic Games as part of Team Canada's integrated support team and consults several Olympic athletes from around the world, including his wife Hillary, who competed for Canada in the 1500 meters at the 2012 and 2016 Olympic Games. Trent is also the main author of a recent narrative review on sports medicine entitled Nutrition and Altitude: Strategies to Enhance Adaptation, Improve Performance, and Maintain Health, which will be the basis of our interesting talk today. So hang on to your seats because this is going to be a big one, and I'm really excited to share with you this conversation with Dr. Trent Stellingwerf up next on Feel the Pedal podcast. Trent, we've made it. Welcome to Feel the Pedal podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I know we've tried to connect a few times over the years, but I'm glad we finally connected and we're going to make this happen. I look forward to it.
I'm looking forward to it as well, Trent. It's been a while since we wanted to do this, and I'm glad we're finally going to pull this one off. So, Trent, where exactly are you based in, and what can you tell us about your work and career?
Sure. I live in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. It's right near Vancouver and Seattle, and I work at one of our Olympic training centers, the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific, where I'm a performance director. I primarily do physiology and nutrition work with track and field and a few other endurance sports mainly, but then I'm also adjunct at the local universities for research purposes.
Trent, as I understand, just like some other researchers like James Morton, like Louise Burke and Graham Close, just to cite a few, you are an example of a researcher who is both on the lab and on the field as well. How important do you believe this is when designing and producing scientific research?
Yeah, no, great question. I think there's a continuum to research that we need to appreciate all levels and types of research. So certainly there's times when I'll read cell culture and molecular research, and then there's times that I'll read really practical field-based case studies, and then there's everything in between. And I think the best individuals is that we have a depth of knowledge maybe in one or two fields, but that we pull back enough to take a breadth of knowledge and understand how the various systems, right from molecular all the way through to the whole body, integrate together as a system. I think by understanding that total spectrum or appreciating it, you're never going to understand it all. There's too much information out there. It puts you in a better place to understand where and how some of the more maybe laboratory-based research can actually be applied in the field. The other thing I think that is underappreciated by, say, pure academic scientists is just the insights of a great coach. Coaches can trial and error research ideas, although they won't call it research, over and over and over again in the field. And a lot of them have great insights for great ideas and great projects. They just don't even realize it in their environment. So I get a lot of the best research ideas and questions directly from being in the field, talking to coaches openly, creating a space where we can just chit-chat and brainstorm.
Totally agree. And in some way, perhaps athletes and coaches are the ones who make the best research questions, right?
They are. They can also be the most challenging at times to work with. By the definition of elite, like truly elite, it means there's very few of them on the planet. So you just automatically have issues with being powered well enough to show an outcome. Furthermore, I truly do think that at times the elite of the elite are obviously they're still human, but their metabolism and their physiology and their biomechanics are so extreme and so unique that you almost have to put your expectations on the side and appreciate that the outcomes might be different. A classic example is, all the beetroot research is in the elite of the elite endurance athletes with VO2 maxes over about 60 or 65, which is pretty much every elite endurance athlete. Beetroot appears not really to work. And there's a prime example of general population studies not working in elites, for example.
You're already giving me ideas for future podcasts. That's an excellent way to start this one, Trent. And today's topic is perhaps one that benefits from the considerable field experience that you have with athletes going to altitude training camps, and that certainly helps you have a much better sensitivity to the questions that need to be answered. So this is the topic that brings us here today, nutrition and altitude training in cycling. We could say this is perhaps an emerging field in sports sciences, not exactly altitude training per se, because this has been a common practice for a few years now, but the nutrition-related aspects that may be associated with altitude exposure. And as we know, competing at moderate altitudes is a particularity of some cycling stages. Cyclists during race events such as Tour de France, Giro d'Italia, and Vuelta a España. And cyclists may benefit from previous exposure and adaptation to a hypobaric hypoxia environment. And this interview, as we've mentioned, came to be mainly thanks to Dr. Trent's contribution in the past few years for the research surrounding altitude exposure, in particular iron supplementation and energy availability, but also due to two recent narrative reviews published on Sports Medicine, a first one regarding contemporary periodization of altitude training for elite performance athlete, and a more recent one entitled Nutrition and Altitude Strategies to Enhance Adaptation, Improve Performance and Maintain Health. Two remarkable papers that I surely recommend you to read carefully, and which are the basics for our talk today here with Dr. Trent Stellingwerf. So before digging into this, Trent, what led you and the other co-authors to write this paper in the first place?
Yeah, probably some life circumstances where the stars lined up and we're able to get there to be able to write these. So I will answer it with a little bit of a story. First of all, I would never entertain doing a narrative review or a consensus statement review unless I've actually done multiple research projects on the topic. And so historically, Athletics Canada, every single April, has a national team training camp at altitude up in Flagstaff, where all our athletes from across Canada, all our endurance athletes, our top ones anyways, all arrive in Flagstaff for 3 or 4 weeks of altitude training. I've been the physiologist at that camp for many, many years, and I quickly thought, this is an excellent opportunity to do some applied research because all the athletes and very elite athletes are coming to you. And so over the years, we've done a series of projects up in Flagstaff with our various athlete cohorts. Over the years, I've collaborated back and forth with Inigo Majuka, who's the lead author on the altitude training periodization paper. As well, I know of Vish Sharma, who's on that paper, and everything lined up where we realized a narrative review on nutrition for low to moderate altitude had not really been well done. Most of our knowledge is on high altitude, so that's 3,000 to 5,000 meters, and that there's only between a Vish and a few of us, only a few papers done at the normal low to moderate altitudes that most people train at. Secondly, Inigo contacted me and said, hey, we're going to write a training review. I know you've been to altitude many, many times. Do you want to be part of that? So everything kind of lined up that both of these papers were simultaneously occurring over the last year and a half. It takes a while to write papers with nearly 200 references. And both of them ended up being accepted to Sports Medicine within about a month of each other. And so they're kind of linked. They're not companion papers, but they almost could be. I will absolutely highlight all the amazing co-authors on the nutrition review as well. I mentioned Inigo and Avish on the altitude training, but the altitude nutrition review we had Peter Peeling involved, who's a world expert on iron, Laura Garvican-Lewis, who's done tons of altitude research and resting metabolic rate research out of the AIS. Rebecca Hall, we published an iron altitude paper with her. Anna Kovatstu out of Norway has done a lot of work on antioxidants and altitude. Ida Haikura is on all those papers that we did in Flagstaff on energy availability, along with Louise Burke. So I always try to emphasize that every project ever always involves a great team. So that's kind of how they all came about.
I think there's no doubt this was a result of a great team of experienced people who are experts on their own fields, and this is perhaps one of the reasons this is a tremendous piece of work covering a broad spectrum of different areas regarding altitude exposure. Trent, perhaps I think it would be important to provide some foundation of altitude training exposure for the listeners before getting into the specifics on the benefits of the nutrition-related interventions in this context. Why do athletes engage in altitude exposure in the first place, and what are the cutoffs that you've already started to mention there for the different altitude thresholds?
Yeah, so historically, some of the first altitude research that was ever done was actually done by a guy named Jack Daniels in the U.S. that published a paper way back when in the late 60s, prior to the Mexico Olympics in 1968, that were going to be held at altitude. Obviously, at that Mexico Olympics, there were a lot of native Highlanders, so Kenyans, who really exploded onto the scene as a world dominant force and have continued to this day. But that was our first insights into the potential of altitude training to augment full stop endurance training. Since then, done by lots of different folks around the world, there's been a huge amount of altitude training research. And I think we can now pretty confidently say that in most situations, it's low to moderate altitudes that people seek out. So it's somewhere between 1,800 to 2,400 meters, around 2,000 meters, as it's high enough then that you're getting enough EPO stimulus to generate and increase red blood cell responses, but still low enough that the hypoxic-induced training fatigue is not too extreme, and the training intensities are not too compromised. When you go to 3,000 or 4,000 meters, it is very difficult as a cyclist or a runner or any athlete to even get close to race intensities or race paces. It's just too high. And indeed, if you look around the world and you look at the most popular altitude training locations, all of them fit into that nice little tight bandwidth of 2,000 meters, give or take a few hundred meters. So, you have Faux-Rameau, or you have St. Moritz, you have Flagstaff, you have Boulder, Colorado, and there's all these popular spots all around the world. The Rift Valley in Africa is around that altitude. And most recently, Robert Chapman out of the U.S. actually did a paper where they exposed athletes to different altitudes and again showed that 2,000 to about 2,400 meters as an ideal altitude height or elevation. Now, there's probably three main adaptations that you're looking for out of altitude training. One is through a drop in SpO2 or oxygen saturation in the blood from altitude. There's a response to increased EPO release, and over 3 to 4 weeks, most studies show a 3 to 6% increase in hemoglobin mass, so the amount of red blood cells. And hemoglobin mass is highly correlated to VO2 max and endurance performance outcomes. There's also non-hematological adaptations, although the study in this space, in this area, is very underrepresentative. There's literally 2 or 3 papers total, but it does look like within the muscle, so non-hematological, non-blood adaptations, that within a few weeks, there's increases in muscle buffering capacity. There's potentially increases in blood buffering capacity, so buffering is important for lactate and intensity. And it looks like there's also changes and improvements in running economy, and so there's other factors to consider. Furthermore, HIF-1 alpha, hypoxic-inducing factor 1 alpha, is turned on with hypoxia, and that in the muscle can send a whole cascade of molecular responses to increase from mitochondria to increase capillarization, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, I would be remiss to say that there's also this wonderful training camp effect. athletes isolate themselves, concentrate and focus on their training, remove life distractions, and basically, every site I mentioned earlier on is also bloody beautiful and inspirational. If you're in Flagstaff in April, the world's best runners all descend there. If you're, up in and around St. Moritz or into Italy, there's just tons of cyclists and runners there training, and it's such a beautiful spot, an inspirational spot to really lay down some amazing training. So it's multifactorial. It's complex. Training at sea level and nutrition at sea level is already challenging and complex. But if done right, I truly believe for all those factors, it can be an effective tool to get a little bit more out of endurance training.
Really, really interesting insights, Trent. And so, as you've mentioned, one of the main reasons that perhaps motivated both these narrative reviews is the fact that most physiological conditionings available on the scientific literature have been observed to high to extreme altitudes, whose effects might differ from those observed to low to moderate altitudes. And in your paper, you present several themes involving nutrition for altitude exposure. Could you please tell us briefly about them so that we can go over them in more detail throughout this episode?
Yeah, sure, no problem. And you've nailed it. Indeed, the vast majority of altitude-related research that we have in responses, as well as nutrition and changes in metabolism, when you look at all those papers, a whole bunch of them are all done at 4,303 meters. And that just happens to be the altitude of Pikes Peak and the U.S. military Army laboratory that they have on the top of Pikes Peak at 4,300 meters. So there's been amazing research that's come out of that facility on Pikes Peak over the years, but the relevance and the application of metabolism and nutrition and physiological changes that happen at 4,300 meters to 2,000 meters is unknown. And there's a lot of massive assumptions in the literature and even in previous reviews that we can just take 4,300 meter research and apply it to 2,000 meters. And I would caution against that. There's certainly changes at 2,000 meters compared to sea level, but they're not nearly as extreme as 4,000 meters. So when we developed our review, what we did is we looked at, just to add structure around it, we looked at 6 major themes. We first looked at energy requirement differences, so energy availability, energy intake, body mass changes. What are the evidence that changes at extreme to high altitudes versus moderate altitudes that athletes train at? We then looked at metabolism differences. Is there increased glycogen or carbohydrate needs at extreme altitudes versus low to moderate altitudes? We then looked at, and these are together, is there increased oxidative stress, and therefore do you have increased antioxidant requirements? So there's a section on that. We also looked at iron requirements at various altitudes. And then to finish it off, we have a section on various ergogenic supplements that have started to be experimented with and studied somewhat at various altitudes. And so those are our kind of 5 major themes. And then we just looked at the evidence with, again, emphasis on 2,000 meters with reference to the higher altitudes, but in many instances saying we're not sure there's any evidence to say it translates to 2,000 meters.
Terrific, Trent. And we'll try to go over each and every of these themes that you've dedicated your attention to throughout this episode. But starting off with something that I found interesting while reading your paper is that perhaps altitude can affect cyclists and endurance athletes in general in a different way. Is there a lot of variation in how much riders can benefit from altitude exposure? I mean, can this be in some way related to the fact that some riders are born and bred in altitude, riders like many Colombians such as Egan Bernal, Rigoberto Urán, Nairo Quintana, or are there any other factors that enter the mix as well?
Yeah, there's probably 2 major things to consider there. Every single endurance sport features different cyclic properties. Cyclic meaning how many revolutions per minute you actually do. And swimming's a lot different than rowing in terms of strokes per minute, is a lot different than running and a lot different than cycling. And therefore, what is the actual muscle time under tension differences across those sports? And so for rowing, for example, if you go to altitude, they're taking 20 strokes a minute. That's it. It's a slow kind of diesel endurance sport. While in cycling, a lot of cyclists are up at around 100, give or take, plus or minus 10 or 20 revolutions per minute. So that it's a much higher cyclic frequency that's much similar to running. Although in cycling, you're weight supported. And my experience over the years is the safest sport to get into, safest meaning least risk of a maladaptation, tends to be cycling, in fact. And that's because in running or in swimming, it's really hard to slow down much beyond a low-grade jog. And in swimming, you'll actually sink in the pool. In cycling, you can change your gears. You can half wheel a day if you're feeling totally blasted or exhausted. You can coast. There's no coasting in running. There's no coasting in swimming. And so it's a very different type of paradigm that you're dealing with. It's a high frequency endurance sport. And it's an endurance sport where you can change your gears to stay at high frequency and also very easily access higher altitudes. It's very hard for an athlete. A runner needs flat space. Someone in a pool, there's only so many pools at altitude. While in cycling, you can target all sorts of different altitudes and heights of altitudes to get the desired response that you're looking for. And you can also vary, again, low gear versus high gear ratios to, again, create different types of hypoxic responses, either more peripheral or cardiovascular response with high cadence versus a more muscular response with low cadence. So there's a lot of options and opportunity in cycling that are a lot different than other sports. So hopefully that kind of sets a bit of a cycling perspective compared to other endurance sports. By extension, one of the hardest sports to work with I've found is swimming, just because you already have your face in the water at sea level, so there's already a hypoxic factor to swimming. Secondly, you can only swim so slow technically, and when at altitude under hypoxia and fatigued, technically it's really challenging at altitude at times, and I think the live high, train low aspects for swimming are more important than some of the other sports. Now, you also mentioned native highlanders there, and for sure, the responses you get in your grand tours when the roads go up over 1,600 to 2,000 meters. I used to live in Switzerland. I've cycled over a lot of the major passes. I know how I felt going over the Grand St. Bernard, which tends to be the highest pass when they go over that in the Tour de France or Giro. The metabolism's different, and that's where your native highlanders seem to really excel over the last 5 kilometers of those really high alpine passes, which can be all the difference you need to win a Grand Tour. There is a whole host of research looking at native highlanders and the difference between native highlanders, for example, and how we've evolved differently from individuals in Tibet versus individuals in South America. I don't want to get too far into a rabbit hole, but the evolutionary responses from those two locations are quite different. One of them has a very large increase in red blood cells. The other group doesn't. They protect more in another way, but there's no question that long-term native highlanders seem to handle altitude much better than individuals born at sea level that use altitude consistently. I think you can bridge the gap through multiple altitude training camps as a native Sealander, but there does seem to be a distinct advantage of being born and raised at altitude.
Wow, fantastic, Trent. It's really, really interesting to know that difference between different sports when it comes to adaptations to altitude. I really had never thought about it that way. So, Trent, and how can we know for sure if the athlete is ready for altitude exposure or if he's going to benefit at all? After all, we're talking about imposing a greater stress to induce adaptations. Is there any sort of checklist we can go over before considering this protocol?
Yeah, I think there's probably two parts to that answer. One is more philosophical and one is more physiological. For me, philosophically, I think an elite endurance athlete needs to have mastered most of their trade at sea level before you start to think of layering in extra stresses in altitude. So they already do a really good job and have almost maximized for where they're at in their sport, training volumes and training adaptations. They're really good at recovery at sea level. They know how to dial in food. They know how to take snacks. They know how to execute their fueling or not, depending on training for that day and whatever that looks like. They tend to recover well. They're just kind of more overall mature athletes. It doesn't make sense for me to take a 14, 15, 16-year-old emerging kid and have them go to 3 or 4 altitude camps a year. I think it's too much too quick, and you want to phase that in philosophically, for me at least, a little more slowly. So there's that kind of aspect. Secondly, there is some thoughts that you can do a pre-altitude test, and Robert Chapman has published on this, where you do a sea level and then a simulated hypoxic maximal exercise test and look at oxygen saturation using an oximeter on the finger to get a sense of athlete desaturation during maximal sea level exercise, as well as simulated hypoxia. And that the responses from that might predict whether or not someone desaturates more or less at altitude, because there's a paradox there. The more you suffer, or the more you desaturate at altitude, the more you tend to feel a little bit crappy and suffer, and your training intensities and paces are probably a bit slower. But that exact same desaturation is what signals EPO to be continually released and allows for optimization of red blood cells potentially, as well as that HIF-1 alpha muscular response. So, for example, we will at times with some athletes after a few weeks send them to progressively higher and higher altitudes to train. So we continually get a significant desaturation because they respond quite quickly to 2,000 meters, and, easy runs or easy rides, they might not desaturate very much. Well, we want to maybe seek out higher roads then, or higher trails to continue with that adaptive response. So there's a few things there to consider before just booking your ticket and flying off to altitude.
We now see a market that offers a multitude of normobaric hypoxia training and altitude simulation equipment, even available to those less athletic. So what are the main differences between normobaric hypoxia and hypobaric hypoxia, and what may be the pros and the cons of each of these approaches? Is the dose of hypoxia important here?
Yeah, obviously, maybe just to keep it simple for the listener, I'll just rename it natural altitude versus synthetic altitude.
Sure.
Yeah, so synthetic altitude is an altitude house or an altitude tent or a nitrogen chamber or something like that set up at sea level. While natural altitude, it's hypobaric, so you're getting a slightly different response at altitude. And there are some nuanced responses between synthetic and natural altitude. Gregoire Millet out of Lausanne has probably done most of that research. However, if you collapse it all together, the major and the biggest difference is just the total hypoxic dose that you can get. So if you have a hypoxic house or a large hypoxic tent, it's pretty challenging to get more than, and you're sleeping in it overnight, it's pretty challenging to get more than 70 or 80 hours of hypoxic stimulus in your tent per week. If you go to natural altitude, up to St. Moritz or Font-Romeu, there's 160 hours in a week of hypoxic dose. And even if you go down to sea level from St. Moritz down to, say, Italy and Chiavenna, you're only taking a few hours off that. So you're still getting 160 to 164 hours of total hypoxic dose. And one of the co-authors on our nutrition paper, Laura Garvick-Lewis, along with one of the world's best altitude researchers, Chris Gore out of the AIS, have penned a couple of papers looking at hypoxic dose, which is the number of hours accumulated at a set altitude. So it's kind of an area under the curve. And that correlates really well, or decently well, with red blood cell responses. And so you can take an athlete and they're going to be 2.5 weeks at a set altitude. On average, we would expect, X% of red blood cells. And if you take a large group, as we do, 30 or 40 athletes to Flagstaff in Canada here, the averages work out pretty well. So those are the two biggest differences, I believe, with using altitude tents as well as natural altitude. And when in doubt, 9 times out of 10 would recommend the use of natural altitude if it's feasible for you. It can be more expensive. In some ways, you can probably get a used altitude tent nowadays online for a few $1,000s. You don't have to travel. You can use it at home. And indeed, a lot of elite training groups use tents in combination with natural altitude. So they'll use a tent for 6, 7, 8 weeks leading into altitude to try to get an initial bump up, albeit smaller in red blood cells. So when they arrive at altitude, they're already pre-adapted somewhat. I've seen elite training groups sleep even higher at altitude by using an altitude tent at altitude, so in St. Moritz. So they're sleeping at night at 3,000 or 4,000 meters rather than the 2,000 meters at the hotel in St. Moritz. And then there's, I believe, a paper that will be published soon. I've seen bits and pieces of it around the last few years, with the idea of using a tent after altitude, natural altitude, as a way to maintain longer the red blood cell response. So there's less red blood cell breakdown or neocytolysis. So there are ways I think you can strategically use a tent, but I don't know, the data that I see and the experiences that I've seen is nothing really trumps going to a location at natural altitude and getting that prolonged exposure.
Yeah, interesting. Let's hope for that research on the complementary role of artificial altitude after natural altitude to come out. And Trent, when undergoing low to moderate altitude exposure, what is the rationale between what we know as live high, train high, or a live high, train low protocols? Can athletes, for example, alternate between both these approaches during a 3-4 week period?
Oh, absolutely. And for sure, I think depending on the mode of exercise, whether you're cycling or running or swimming or rowing, depending on the time of the season, so whatever preparation periodization phase that you're in, and then depending on the location, can you even go low to train low? These are all considerations in designing the training program for a good altitude camp. And so, for example, in the fall phase, as you're doing a general prep, and you might choose a location where it's just live high, train high the entire time, because you're a little less worried about the exact wattages or running speeds that you have to hit at that time of the year. You're a ways off from the major competitions. For a lot of athletes, as they're approaching and doing an altitude camp in March or April in the spring, they will tend to choose locations that allow for easier access to sea level training. So St. Moritz is one of those. Flagstaff is one of those. You can drive down into the valley from Flagstaff to Sedona or Cottonwood. And what you would do is probably 80 or 90% or the vast majority of your training still high. But for those really key high intensity interval type based sessions, you would go down the mountain to really nail those wattages or running speeds or whatever the purpose of that workout is, primarily due to the fact that the vast majority of competitions are at sea level. And therefore, there's a neuromuscular or biomechanical consideration that you need as well. And it's just better mimicked at sea level. So manipulating live high, train high versus live high, train low is part of the art of coaching and part of the art of sports science. There's no perfect studies out there in this space of how to manipulate that well, because every athlete's training slightly differently, and there's just different sports and different considerations. And you have to look at everything like this when sitting down and designing a training camp and the training that goes with it.
No doubt, and it's certainly our job as nutritionists to pay attention to all those details and be able to adapt the nutrition strategies accordingly. And as we've been discussing, Trent, many of the changes at high altitudes are not observed at moderate altitudes, at least not at the same level, and some of them may actually be related to a downregulation of protein synthesis, increased protein requirements, as well as changes in energy, carbohydrate, and fluid turnover, as you've mentioned. So, starting to tackle the main themes you've mentioned, according to your review, altitude exposure doesn't seem to consistently induce changes in the relative contribution of carbohydrate or fat to the total energy as observed at higher altitudes. So the question I believe it's fair to ask here is, since carbohydrate periodization, using for example the fuel for the work required a framework, is currently one of the most accepted strategies to maximize training adaptation with carbohydrate manipulation in endurance sports, can this model be used in a typical low to moderate exposure protocol, or should we aim for a more conservative chronic high carbohydrate approach?
It depends. It really depends on it really depends on the level of the athlete, how much altitude they've used in the past, whether or not they're really good at dialing in the intensities that they need at altitude, and what the overall goal or what the individual athlete's gap is. And so, yes, when periodized right and tracked right and monitored right, I don't think there's no issues or any issues with fuel for the work required or periodizing carbohydrate throughout the day. at an altitude training camp. That said, your wiggle room gets a lot tighter and smaller. And for error, I mean extreme overreaching to overtraining symptoms and or maladaptation and or increasing potential inflammation or illness or sickness, just because hypoxia does add another stress, and now you're adding a nutrition stress on top of that as well. This is one of the areas, if I switch gears a little bit here, and one of the major assumptions is that altitude at 2,000 meters increases carbohydrate oxidation and requirement. There's actually very little data out there at that altitude to say that, yes, that's definitively been shown, as all of it has been at about 4,300 meters at Pikes Peak. And the two or three studies up there, 3 or 4 studies, most of them have shown an relative increase in utilization of carbohydrate and glycogen use at higher altitudes. There is one study from Pikes Peak that showed the opposite, though, and we highlight that in our paper too. In females, there was actually a decreased carbohydrate oxidation or utilization. The tricky bit is it's whether the athletes are doing the same relative intensity as sea level versus absolute intensity as sea level. So if a rider let's just keep this really simple, most of their easy rides at 200 watts, and they go to altitude at 2,000 meter at 200 watts. And so the absolute intensity is the same. No question, you're going to burn and oxidize more glycogen and have higher carbohydrate needs in that situation because the relative intensity is higher because you're in hypoxia. However, if at sea level at 200 watts, you're at a heart rate of 150, and then you go to altitude and you ride at 150 beats per minute, and now your wattage is dropped to 175, so the relative intensity is the same. In that paradigm, the carbohydrate oxidation is probably the same. And so that's sometimes where athletes swear that when they go to moderate altitudes, they have higher carbohydrate needs. I agree with them. And it's probably because they're training at a relatively higher intensity than sea level. But if they went to sea level and cranked up their intensity, then there's also sea level increased needs for carbohydrate or more carbohydrate and carbohydrate oxidation. So that's a nuance there that's important to understand when looking at the literature first and foremost, but then understanding relative versus absolute training intensities at sea level versus altitude.
So let me get this straight, Trent, and also to clarify this notion for the listeners. When you go to altitude, you are not able to maintain the same intensity, not because there is an increased carbohydrate oxidation and increased glycogen depletion, but because of other factors that are related to altitude exposure. Is this accurate?
Yeah, generally, like if you go to high altitude and you've eaten a lot of carbs the last 24 hours and your power output's down, it's not going to be a glycogen limitation. It's going to be a hypoxic limitation. Your O2 saturation and your ability to deliver adequate oxygen to your working muscles is compromised. So it's a different limitation.
And regarding protein requirements, what data do we have available at low to moderate altitudes regarding muscle protein synthesis and even amino acid oxidation during exercise or even muscle recovery? Is there any difference from the research that we have at high altitudes?
I'm unaware of a single study done on using tracers or biopsies to look at protein requirements at low to moderate altitudes and whether they're shift from sea level. Yes, at high altitudes, it does absolutely look like increased protein requirements along with energy, first and foremost, are required once you're up at mountaineering and extreme altitudes. But our knowledge of that at 2,000 meters is almost non-existent, and whether there are increased requirements beyond the increased requirements per day that elite athletes already need due to the amount of total training they already do. So they should already be in that 1.8 to 2.4 range of grams per kg per day just due to the amount that they train. But right now we don't necessarily recommend any more than that at low to moderate altitudes. Maybe in a few years from now, when there's more studies done, we'll change that advice. But right now, there's nothing to suggest that more is needed.
Okay, so for the moment, athletes should stick to the optimal regular recommendations for protein intake, regardless of altitude exposure.
Correct, at low to moderate altitudes. At the more extreme mountaineering altitudes, First and foremost, energy is most important, but then increasing protein requirements to help with muscle wasting, which happens at extreme mountaineering altitudes. Muscle mass decreases. But again, these are very extreme situations such as Everest attempts, etc.
Sure, so I believe that question about protein is quite clear. And moving on now to energy availability, and this is one of the sections that I think got a lot of attention in your review. It's the section regarding energy availability and its effects on body mass and training adaptations at altitude. So what can you tell us about the evidence on high to extreme altitude exposure, on the effects on energy availability, changes in basal metabolic rate, loss of appetite when compared to those of low to moderate altitudes here? What factors do you believe we should focus our attention on?
Yeah, so the data at the extreme altitudes, high altitudes, so over 3, 4, 5,000 meter range, does seem to consistently show a suppression of appetite, so a compromised energy intake or self-selected energy intake. It does seem to consistently show an increase in RMR, resting metabolic rate, which is obviously linked to basal metabolic rate. So you're getting a double whammy. You're not eating as much, plus you're oxidizing and just burning more energy. And that at those extreme altitudes, that does result in poor energy availability, muscle wasting, and body mass losses. I think that relationship is pretty strong in the literature, again, at the high to extreme altitudes. However, does that relationship exist at the low to moderate altitudes that most athletes train at? And there's a bit of a question mark. We're unaware of any data to suggest at low to moderate altitudes, appetite and self-selected energy intake is shifted or changed. There are literally 2 smaller projects out of the AIS, and I think across those 2 research papers, there might literally be 11 athletes, where one of them showed a small bump up of about 15% in resting metabolic rate at 2,000 meters. However, in the other paper, they didn't show that as much. And they did show a trend towards less energy intake, but it was also during overtraining and overreaching, which also just happens there, just from the training stress. And so perhaps there's some indicators that there is a small bump up in resting metabolic rate, but the number of studies and the number of subjects tested on that is so low that we still put a bit of a question mark there. Finally, if we look at just body mass changes in the published literature and unpublished literature across altitude training camps at about 2,000 meters, there really doesn't seem to be any consistent relationships with loss in body mass at low to moderate altitudes. I will state, however, over and over again, body mass on its own as an indicator of energy availability is a very, very poor indicator, primarily due to the fact that resting metabolic rate starts to decline and shut off as you go into poor energy availability, and therefore it tries to conserve body mass. You need much other indicators, but it's a really rough indicator potentially of adequate energy intake for what's required for training. And we even took, 100 or 130 of our athletes over multiple years and plotted their body weight changes as a percent and compared it to hemoglobin mass, and didn't really find any relationship to that. We looked at illness rates and body mass changes, didn't really find any relationships there either. So I think just like at sea level, you have to focus on the fact that food is a fuel, and fuel is energy. And I do a lot of research on relative energy deficiency in sport. We want to make sure you're in adequate energy availability at sea level and at low to moderate altitude to maximize the training benefit. In one of our papers as well, we found that, as a bit of an aside, which is interesting, we found that eumenorrheic females that arrived at our altitude camp, so those without a menstrual cycle, a really big indicator of low energy availability or chronic low energy availability, they actually had 8% lower hemoglobin mass than the amenorrheic females, the ones with a normal menstrual cycle. I might have got eumenorrheic and amenorrheic messed up there, but I think you understand what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because most athletes will spend thousands and thousands of dollars for a 3-week altitude training camp in the hope of getting a 3 to 5% increase in hemoglobin mass, when in fact, if you fuel enough to have a functioning menstrual cycle, you can already from that just have an 8% on average increase in hemoglobin mass upon arrival. There probably is some research that needs to be done on blood as well.
I'm really glad you've mentioned RED-S, the relative energy deficiency in sport that has been tackled here on the podcast before, and quite recently by yourself, along with your wife Hillary, on another podcast that I absolutely love, the Science of Sport podcast with Ross Tucker. My compliments to him. And you've based your talk there on the recent case of Mary Cain, and I'm sure the listeners are familiar with this case, and this represents a radical example of energy restriction in an endurance athlete taken to the extreme with tremendously negative consequences for the athlete. So what I'd like to ask you, Trent, is could a pre-existing REDS compromise pre-altitude hemoglobin mass and iron values in both genders when seeking these pre-altitude related training adaptations? And let me throw a second one there. Should RED-S or even any sort of eating disorder be a prerequisite to consider before choosing what athletes should or should not go into an altitude training camp?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, the emerging information on REDS in males is much underdeveloped in the research compared to females, but the emerging information does suggest that females are more susceptible to the symptoms and outcomes of REDS than males. And absolutely, males need to be aware of this as well, but there seems to be perhaps a more protective effect of testosterone in males than in females. As I said before, the females with the REDS indicators, so lack of a menstrual cycle, just even on arrival to altitude, at 8% lower hemoglobin than the other females. We did not see that in males with REDS indicators, so there might be sex-based differences there. That said, the females with the 8% lower hemoglobin mass, the ones that were in REDS, still showed a quite positive response in hemoglobin at altitude. I would say as well that obviously REDS is a continuum, and that these athletes were kind of in the yellow score for REDS. They weren't kind of orange or red. If there was an extreme REDS case like an eating disorder, I absolutely would not advise altitude training. You have enough stress that you're dealing with, and you have to stay home with a great support network around that athlete to get them on track to be healthy and happy first and foremost. But REDS is a continuum from a green light through to yellow. Maybe there's an orange and then a red. Right now it's just green, yellow, and red rankings. But extreme cases of REDS, I would not send them to altitude. There's already enough stress in their life. Yeah, so there does seem to be sex-based differences. But we know this as well, is to make red blood cells requires protein synthesis. And protein synthesis, at least muscle protein synthesis and albumin protein synthesis, does seem to be based on energy as well. So if you have inadequate energy, I truly do believe you will be compromised in your ability to optimize red blood cell production and just red blood cell health. There are also some indications in the REDS literature, although this is emerging, and I wouldn't say the data is a slam dunk yet, that individuals in REDS may have a higher predisposition to anemia or low iron. And so it's just important to screen for that as well. But yeah, there's a lot of work there that needs to be done for sure.
So if there's a checklist of things to consider before going into an altitude training camp, RED-S might actually be one of them. So switching gears now to hydration, another of the themes that you referred. Such as stated in your paper, altitude environments are associated with low air humidity, which could also increase fluid losses. So my question here would be, does altitude play an additional factor here to consider when estimating fluid losses, or should we just face altitude exposure as any other training camp regardless of altitude?
Yeah, no question that in most situations when you go to higher altitude, there is lower air humidity. That's just part and parcel of going to higher altitudes. And with that situation, your hydration needs do go up. However, I would also say that the environmental weather of the location of the altitude camp that you've chosen is probably the more important factor. So, for example, looking at morning hydration monitoring as a good tool to just keep athletes a bit on track. And there's issues with the USGs, don't get me wrong, but we can assume that USG first thing in the morning voided is at least one of the more stable ones. And it is a nice tool to just teach athletes a little bit in and around hydration status. Just over the years, St. Moritz, for example, has lakes up there and a forest, and it'll rain more often. It seems like, and I should go tally it up, it's much easier for athletes in St. Moritz to stay hydrated than in Flagstaff. To get to Flagstaff, you literally drive through a desert, and you come up a little bit into some more forest, but it is very desert-like, coupled with high altitude. And so just that background environment, being in Arizona, is probably more important for hydration than the actual 2,000 meters of altitude. But it's absolutely something athletes need to stay a little bit more on top of. And obviously, cardiac output and the ability for VO2 max is driven both by red blood cell mass, but also total blood volume and plasma volume. And if you're just chronically dehydrated, you're not going to get as much out of your hard training sessions as your cardiac output will be compromised due to dehydration effects, even just showing up. So yeah, it is important to stay on top of that, even at moderate altitudes.
Mm-hmm. So would you say it is more location specific than altitude specific?
Yes, I would say that. Both are considerations, but yeah, when you're at altitude in the desert versus in Flagstaff versus all the nice lakes and beautiful forests at St. Moritz, it really is apples and oranges between those two spots. Although St. Moritz itself, because of the altitude, will still have increased hydration requirements than down the mountain in sea level at Switzerland.
Fantastic, Trent. Probably the section or the theme that got the most attention in your review, and that appears to perhaps be the most likely factor to condition the outcomes of altitude exposure, is iron status and iron supplementation. And this section is really, really well described and summarizes in your review paper, and I must insist and encourage the listeners to go and check it out. Trent has also performed some interesting research on this before regarding iron supplementation at altitude. So please, Trent, what can you tell us about the importance of iron and related blood markers on the training adaptations with altitude exposure?
Yeah, it's probably the single most important nutrition intervention to consider with athletes going to or at altitude, full stop. And it still is mind-boggling to me that some athletes go to altitude and don't even know what their baseline irons or ferritins are, or let alone have a plan around iron supplementation. As again, you spend thousands of dollars to go to altitude, and this is a major part of optimizing and maximizing the red blood cell responses. And that's primarily due to the fact that hemoglobin has 4 heme proteins, and heme is made up of iron, and there's 4 heme proteins per hemoglobin that help transport oxygen. And if you're making more red blood cells than hemoglobin, you need more iron there to be a substrate for that increased red blood cell proliferation. That's the primary reason there's increased iron requirements at altitude. Ben Levine and Stray Gunderson are pioneers in altitude training. They were the first ones to really look at the live high, train low. But they actually they never published this. There's a 1992 abstract at the American College of Sports Medicine that and those abstracts are published, but they never put it in a paper, showing for the first time that individuals that went to altitude, and I think, I'm going from memory here, they had ferritins under 15, showed much less red blood cell responses than the athletes that went to altitude with ferritins over 15. These athletes weren't even supplemented. And so then we go forward, and one of probably a whole bunch of years, there's a big gap there where no one addressed this in the research. And then the AIS did a retrospective analysis on a whole bunch of their altitude training camps led by Andy Govis, where they looked at hemoglobin mass percent change in athletes that went to altitude and took 0 milligrams of iron. I think it was 105 milligrams of iron daily, or double that, 210 milligrams of iron, elemental iron daily. And there was a somewhat rough dose-response relationship there in that, off the top of my head again, I might get these percentages a little off, that the athletes that had 0 milligrams of iron only showed a 1 to 2% increase in hemoglobin mass throughout the camp. The ones that were at 105 milligrams of iron were around 3 or 3.5% increase, and those at 210 milligrams of iron were closer to 4.5% increase in hemoglobin. And so off of that research and our own study where we looked at iron supplementation, it was an intervention study as well. That's with Rebecca Hall as the lead author. That's published. We looked at giving 200 milligrams of iron, but in this instance, all at once at night, versus a split dose, 100 milligrams in the morning and 100 milligrams at night. So both groups got 200 milligrams of elemental iron per day. But due to the hepcidin responses of multiple dosing, and there was emerging research on this at sea level, we got a slightly greater hemoglobin mass results, and it was significant in the single dose, so taking your iron all at once in the evening. It did result in a little higher gastrointestinal discomfort, but that only seemed to hold up in the first week or so, and then the GI side effects were exactly the same. And so for many, many years, the athletes that I work with will do a blood screen ahead of time. We'll find out where their ferritin is. If it's low normal, we will recommend 200 milligrams of elemental iron every single day while at altitude. And we have lots of outputs now that we're getting 4, 5, 6% increases in hemoglobin mass as a group average quite consistently, which is a bit above what some of the studies have shown previously, where iron may not have been included in the protocol. From a GI perspective, it seems to be well handled. And most importantly, post-altitude, we do another blood check. And even 200 milligrams of elemental iron per day sounds really high for some folks. But because it's being embedded and used in red blood cell production, ferritin actually doesn't change that much. So the storage form of iron, it might go up a touch, but it's not going up into the values of 150 or 200 or beyond at all. And so it seems quite safe, well tolerated, and is kind of probably the number one thing that we would recommend. Post-altitude, absolutely, get your blood work done again, and then you can drop your iron supplement back to your pre-altitude sea level protocol. And for some athletes, that might be no iron supplement required, and for other athletes, it might be maybe a lower dose of 25 or 50 milligrams a day, depending on their background blood work and their background profile for anemia. So there's a lot there, but there's a big table in that paper that steps you through what to do pre-altitude, during altitude, and post-altitude for iron, as well as blood work recommendations.
Okay, perfect. And just for listeners to have this part clear, what ferritin values pre-altitude exposure should you aim for in male and female cyclists?
Yeah, so in one of the prior consensus statements, there was some thought that males and females might have a different ferritin cutoff for pre-altitude. We just collapsed it because the data for those sex-based difference ferritin cutoffs is almost non-existent. So usually what we do is if in your pre-test your ferritin's under 15, we basically highlight here, immediately consult your sports physician. And that pre-test should probably be 4 to 6 weeks before altitude is. If you're at 15, you're probably compromising red blood cell production at sea level as well. And therefore an aggressive oral supplementation, or in some instances, if it's the Olympic year, you're under very short time crunch, then IV iron might be indicated just to bounce that iron back up pre-altitude. I will stress that since we've really started being much more diligent with our blood tracking protocols and our endurance athletes, we rarely have to use IV iron ever. And there is a study by, again, Laura Garvikin, who's on the paper, showing that oral iron at altitude and IV iron at altitude both resulted in great responses, and therefore you can just use oral. So I would recommend oral 99 times out of 100. If ferritin is under 35 at your pretest, you might start with 100 milligrams daily leading into altitude, and upon arrival altitude, increase that to 200 milligrams of elemental iron. And if your ferritin's over 35, then you don't need to worry about an iron supplement until you arrive at altitude, and then you can start at 200 milligrams of elemental iron. If your ferritin is way up there, like over 130, you might, again, consider talking to your physician. I would stress that, recommend that. And perhaps in that situation, because there is so much stored iron at altitude, you might only need 50 milligrams of elemental iron per day. However, there's no study to define that or to confirm that. This is the best guess that we had at this point to try to create a framework of if-then scenarios using the science that is present right now. This framework and this figure here might shift and adapt, and I expect it to over the next 5 or 10 years.
Terrific piece of information. And again, for the listeners who got curious around this topic, figure 3 of the paper is where you can find the summary of what Trent has just been talking about. And moving on now to antioxidant supplementation. And in the last couple of years, it has become clear that, at least at sea level, supplementing with high doses of antioxidants can actually impair training adaptations. Going through your review, it appears that the same may also occur at altitude. And Anu Koivaistu, who is one of the co-authors in this review, my apologies to Anu if I didn't get her name correctly, she performed an excellent control trial on this, by the way, on antioxidant supplementation with athletes from several sports during an altitude training camp here in Spain. So, Trent, is this increased oxidative stress significant enough to compromise health and recovery of athletes? And what evidence do we have on the use of antioxidants at low to moderate altitudes, whether in the form of supplements versus a food-based antioxidant approach?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for that lead-in and background context for the listener. We know that reactive oxygen species and nitrogen species are a stimulus for mitochondrial biogenesis and a stimulus for other endurance adaptations. And therefore, eliminating that acutely from exercise stress is not indicated, at least at sea level. And if emerging data at altitude shows that it might compromise or attenuate your altitude adaptations. I don't think there's any problem whatsoever with the increased oxidative stress that happens at low to mild altitudes. For sure, there's increased oxidative stress, but that might be part of the adaptive response of what helps altitude training. And I say that because I don't know how many years I've been going to altitude camps, and we've never supplemented athletes with antioxidants. And maybe the illness rate is a touch higher, but the training intensity and the stress is also a touch higher. But generally speaking, in a well-monitored, a well-planned and thought-out altitude camp, I see positive adaptations, not negative adaptations. And so we've never used high-dose antioxidants, at least in the last 5 or 10 years, in any altitude camp I've ever been involved with. Now, Anu's work, which was great, split elite Norwegian athletes going to an altitude camp into 2 groups. Again, like the sea level literature, they increased antioxidant intake in one of the groups, but they did it through food, not through high-dose, single-dose antioxidants like high-dose vitamin C or E. They did it through food. And as we know with food, it's much more complex than we can ever really appreciate, I believe. There's pro-oxidants, there's antioxidants, there's polyphenols. The way it's metabolized changes the way that antioxidants are delivered to the body or not delivered to the body. And indeed, the group that were on the high antioxidant diet, so in other words, they just ate more fruits and vegetables, had no maladaptation at altitude. Their responses were the exact same as the other group that didn't eat as much. They weren't any better, but there was no maladaptation. Mm-hmm. And so, again, long term, we know fruits and veggies do a lot of really positive things for health and for optimizing adaptation to training. And so I think promoting a really healthy diet at sea level and at altitude is absolutely warranted and should be promoted.
All right, so a food-based antioxidant approach is what we should aim for. And there is also a part in which you mention how would altitude affect muscle buffering capacity. How significant do you believe are these changes in terms of performance, and how do you think this could affect beta-alanine and sodium bicarbonate supplementation at altitude?
The metabolism around endogenous changes in muscle buffering, so from genetics or from training or fiber typing, fast twitch fiber types are great buffers naturally, coupled with altitude-induced, hypoxic-induced changes in muscle buffering. And again, the handful of studies that have done this, it requires muscle biopsies. So I believe there's 2 published total, both of them about 15 years ago. And they do seem to show that altitude does increase muscle buffering capacity or ability to buffer lactate during intense bouts of exercise. And it does appear to be quicker. In both those studies, they show changes in just a couple of weeks at altitude. When you combine that then with the complexity of exogenous consumed ergogenic aids like beta-alanine for intramuscular improvements in carnosine and buffering versus exogenous consumption of acute blood bicarbonate, it gets really complex really quickly. And the long story short is there's very few papers done well at altitude looking at bicarb supplementation or chronic beta-alanine supplementation. It's still a huge area that needs to be really unpacked carefully. And it's challenging to do those studies at time at sea level, let alone having folks at altitude or in hypoxia. So there are indications, perhaps on the sodium bicarb side of things, that it might actually be a negative response at altitude, although that's really emerging. Certainly experientially and in the trenches with athletes, if we're at an altitude camp and it's midsummer and they're in their racing phase, for sure we'll have them use beta-alanine. And I haven't seen any maladaptation there whatsoever, or any issues there with training adaptation, as long as, again, you have a well-monitored, well-thought-out, well-planned altitude training camp. So I don't want to get maybe too far in the weeds on that, because I have written a larger section just about all the unknowns there. And I think one of the tables in the paper, I literally list 25 research questions across all the themes, because there's just so much work that needs to be done at 2,000 meters of altitude that we just don't have all the answers yet.
So aside from the sodium bicarbonate side that you've referred, beta-alanine supplementation wouldn't be conditioned and could be maintained alongside with altitude exposure, right?
I would agree with that. And part of it is, like, for example, beetroot at altitude. Beetroot potentially increases oxygen carrying capacity. Well, do you actually want that at altitude? Because you're trying to get a desaturation in the blood to increase EPO release or to stimulate HIF-1 alpha, and maybe you're circumventing that through beetroot supplementation, and you don't want to do that. So there's a lot of indications there that need to be well thought out. And in certain parts of my practice, I'll be quite progressive and aggressive in trying to bring athletes to peak performance. But in other parts, I would just focus on the basics first and foremost.
And before we start wrapping up here, do you believe there are any other supplements that may be of particular interest while undergoing altitude exposure?
Honestly, we've talked about iron. So iron, yes, as a health supplement. But in terms of ergogenic aids, there's been a bit of work done with N-acetylcysteine or NAC. And again, the research and the data there is all over the place, and nothing's really that consistent. There's a herb, ginkgo biloba, as well. Again, really inconsistent, and or the studies aren't that well done. So generally speaking, no, I wouldn't recommend anything else specific to altitude. Again, at that low to moderate altitudes. When you get to extreme altitudes, maybe some of these things, maybe the data is a little more consistent, but even then, in our table, we still have question marks all the way along the various ergogenic supplements at every altitude.
And I again recommend the listeners to check all of those aspects in the paper to have a much clearer perspective of this. And wrapping up here, Trent, could you please just give us a brief summary of all the recommendations, all the things that you consider that are more essential to take into account based on your experience and based on your review as well when considering altitude exposure in cycling?
You bet. I think if you look at both papers, first and foremost, you need an athlete who's healthy and in a good, consistent training program before launching off into altitude. Secondly, you need a training program that's well thought out and well monitored at altitude. So there's lots of just simple monitoring things that you can put into place to make sure that the athlete is adapting as you hope and as you would. So in that instance, some kind of questionnaire in the morning or hydration check in the morning, periodic body weights are really easy to implement. And then ideally an internal and external load metric that you're able to track over the camp. So in cycling, it could be something like RPE, heart rate, and wattage. Those are three things that are pretty easy to collect in most of your cyclists. So those are two biggies just in and around structuring the camp and monitoring the athlete. When it comes to nutrition, the biggest things, first and foremost, is the iron. It's probably the single most important intervention at low to moderate altitude that we have in terms of evidence. Secondary to that is adequate energy availability throughout the camp. It may not be heightened at low to moderate altitudes, but any training camp situation where athletes are going to go in and thrash themselves for 2 or 3 weeks, that's an important consideration. And then finally, perhaps some increased needs in and around hydration. And that's it. Good wholesome diet, lots of fruits and veggies, eating to satisfy the energy outputs, all the same basic recommendations at sea level. And I think if you can execute those 4 or 5 things I've just mentioned, you're 98, 99% there for having, within reason, successful altitude camps with athletes.
Fantastic, Trent. That's a really good checklist to take into account when considering altitude exposure. And regarding this topic, what developments in research on nutrition for these protocols would you like to see in the next 10 years?
I think there's some really easy stuff to do quite quickly. We need a lot more and a lot larger cohort of resting metabolic rate data. So ideally with the same metabolic cart, because there's variability on that's underappreciated at sea level, and then at altitude at the start of the camp and at the end of the camp, is there an adaptive response to just shifts in resting metabolic rate at low to moderate altitudes. This is completely not invasive. It's done first thing in the morning. The athlete can literally almost sleep lying on the ground with a hood over their face, and they're just getting resting metabolic rate. It's pretty easy to execute, and we just need a lot more numbers there. So that would be one big area that would really help inform whether or not there isn't increased shifts in RMR. We need more information on the non-hematological responses to altitude training. Biopsy studies are challenging, so those would be hard. But even the changes and shifts in blood alkalosis that happens upon arrival to altitude because you hyperventilate upon arrival is not well developed and not well studied. Even descriptively at low to moderate altitudes in elite athletes. So again, that can be done just through finger prick and capillary tubes. It's pretty non-invasive, and it's something that needs to be better characterized. Beyond that, then, there's probably still some questions in and around optimizing iron intake. There's a lot of emerging data around cycling your iron every other day perhaps versus every day, but perhaps some more work at sea level needs to be done first before application to altitude. And then finally, just the integration of ergogenic aids at altitude are probably another really big area that needs a lot of research to be done. So anyone listening, if you're out there, I've listed 25 questions in the paper because I won't have time to do them all. So get cracking. Let's try to learn more as we work together and share and have best practice to optimize our athletes' performances.
So let's get to work then. Let's hope these topics that Trent provided us lead us to more improvements and more developments on this research, and I'm sure they will definitely come. So Trent, I believe we are pretty much done here. In case people want to follow you on social media, I can attest that Trent is quite active on Twitter. So Trent, in case you want to provide your contacts and people want to contact you, where should people go to?
Yeah, I'm probably most active on Twitter. I don't really do any of the other social media platforms. I'm a Strava voyeur. I just watch and track athlete training that way, but I don't use it myself. So Twitter is the best spot, and that's just T Stellingwerf. I'm sure you can post it on the podcast sheet as well.
Yes, of course, I'll make sure to include your Twitter handle on fuelthepedal.com on the episode show notes. Trent, I can't thank you enough for accepting being on the show. This has been a tremendous experience, and I think we have a lot of good information here. And for that, again, I thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the great questions, and thanks for having me on.
It was an absolute pleasure, Trent. Talk to you soon. And that was it, episode 17 with Dr. Trent Stellingwerf from the Canadian Institute of Sport, a man who clearly knows his stuff and not only has a tremendous experience on the field, but is also an incredible communicator. And I believe we all have now a much clearer picture of the altitude exposure factor that we should focus our attention on if we want to help our cyclists or engage into altitude training ourselves. Thank you for sticking until the very end. I am Gabriel Martins, signing off with the promise of coming back soon with more good stuff. Take care, people, and if for some reason this is the last episode you hear from me before Christmas, have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Cheers.